Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story. I'm your host, Todd Nesloni, the Director of Culture and Strategic Leadership at TEPSA. And each episode, I look to bring you a different guest who has encouraged, inspired, or challenged me in one way or another, and bring them on to share some of their story in hopes that it inspires you to share some of yours. Today, I am thrilled to have Jennie Kristoffersen on with me. Thank you so much for being here. Tell everybody kind of who you are and what you do.
Hey, Jennie Kristoffersen here. I'm currently the Chief Academic Officer at Nearpod, but I've been in education for over 20 years. I started as a classroom teacher. 8th grade math was my jam. Then I was a district level math coordinator. And then I've worked for a variety of educational publishers from Pearson to Amplify to Hand of Mind, and have been with Nearpod for the past 3 years. Other thing to know about me is I'm a mom of 2 beautiful kids, ages 3 and 5, and my daughter right now is experiencing distance learning as a pre-K student. So it's been really interesting, exciting to be a part of just kind of this shift in education, both as a professional and as a mom.
I bet. Man, I have so many questions for you. Well, Jennie, the first place I want to start is, you were a teacher for many years. And so when you were growing up, did you know teaching was in your path, or was it something you kind of just fell into and fell in love with?
Well, it really started in high school for me. I had those special experiences that I think a lot of us as educators had, where, I was that student who was helping the teacher when a student was absent. I wrote their test. I mean, I can't believe the teacher had me do that, but I really learned about making sure that answers were whole numbers.
Right.
I think I really made that too difficult for my classmate. But also that was one. But the second was my educators were really treating the whole child before whole child was really a discussion.
Right.
And so I feel like they really saw me. So they saw me beyond academics. They saw me in terms of maybe what I was struggling with as a student, and they didn't disregard it. They actually really kind of nurtured me. They mentored me, and really informs who I am today. But it really wasn't into college. Of course, those first 2 years, I took a lot of the general ed courses and was like, I don't know what I really want to be. Do I want to be a mathematician? Do I want to go into business? It wasn't until I had the opportunity in college to take a volunteerism course and worked with a group of teenagers in an at-risk home.
Oh.
And that's when I said to myself, you know what, I want to serve youth. I want to have an impact in society. And so, joined the School of Ed, and the rest is history as to where I am today.
I'd love to kind of jump into that experience a little bit, because that's always been kind of work that my heart has always been drawn to, but it's so difficult for me to disconnect myself emotionally from those situations. And so what was that experience like for you, being able to see kids in such a different light than sometimes we see them in the educational world?
For me, it really helped me understand, or, at least build an empathy
Right.
for, inequities that might exist, or what does kind of trauma in one's life,
Yeah.
What does that do in kind of in bringing to the table, and how does it present itself?
Mm-hmm.
And what was fascinating is you could see the gifts that maybe even a traditional classroom wouldn't bring about in kind of in those adolescents I was working with. So, the level of artistry I was seeing, but maybe they didn't have the opportunity and voice in order to present that, let's say, in a traditional classroom setting, or maybe they didn't have the same structures that I feel privileged in terms of just my family unit, or the availability because my parents weren't working multiple jobs and had that pressure, right? What did that do to form kind of how they function, maybe how that impacted and what got them there, at this facility itself, and said, you know what, how do we create structures and situations in place that we can acknowledge and recognize kind of either the trauma or the environment that a student is living in order to help everyone realize their potential, because potential is there. It's
Right.
how do we unlock it?
And so is that what drew
really
you into
motivated me.
is that what drew you into like working with 8th graders?
That's a different story. I didn't realize that one, right? I think all of us as we journey, like, what do I want to be when I grow up, right? So when I first went into the School of Ed, I chose to focus on K through 8, and I did my student teaching in a third grade classroom. And it was very quick that I realized that third grade probably wasn't kind of my sweet spot, nor was just elementary in general. I can remember this plain as day. My cooperating teacher told me, Jenny, you have to tell these third graders that they have to glue the clock right side up with the 12 at the top. And I said to myself, I want them to know that the 12 goes at the top. So like I could identify very quickly that maybe elementary school wasn't my sweet spot. And I found in, my first teaching jobs were more straddling around the middle school, early high school. But I found I really enjoyed middle school because I think it's just as special as someone who, I think kindergarten's just as special. It's like not everybody's cut or made out for those grade levels, right? And I liked the fact that at times they were a little rough and they didn't love you as a teacher, right? And they're balancing kind of the social and emotional with academics. But when nobody was around, they loved you. And they would give you a gift for a holiday or whatnot. But I like to be able to say, you know what you should be doing right now, so I want you to do it so that I could focus on the academics rather than some of those foundational skills. It really wasn't until I became a math coordinator. I was a math coordinator of a district that had 12 schools, 9 elementary, 3 middle school, that I started to really appreciate the elementary environment a bit more. And later in my years as a math coordinator was actually contemplating, do I go back into that third grade classroom and take it on again?
I love that. I've seen myself think through those same kind of things as I've been continuing to work in education. But, as I feel like as people, as we grow and get older, our passions change. And, I've talked about this on many episodes that I don't feel like it means we love anything that we used to do any less. Like I don't teach a group of 5th graders in the classroom anymore, but I still love teaching 5th graders in the classroom. I've wanted to pursue other things along the way. And so obviously at some point you decide, you know what, I want to step out of this traditional classroom into a larger classroom as a math coordinator, and then as an even larger classroom to work with even more educators with some different organizations. When did you know that that was kind of in your path of interest?
I didn't choose it. It chose me. I was in the right place at the right time for a string of events. Just so happened when I was a classroom teacher, I was doing work for Pearson, which was Prentice Hall at the time. I'm going to date myself as a publisher because I was the Ask an Expert on one of their math programs. And so it really was this opportunity where I could kind of leave that kind of math coordinator and then that classroom environment prior to that to have a greater impact. And why did I why did I accept that opportunity to kind of make the transition out is even when I was in the classroom as a teacher, I wasn't just thinking about how can my students learn fractions better. I was wondering systematically, how can we do this with more teachers? Right? Like I was always thinking big picture. How can we change how we're doing things? My master's work, especially all of my formal education in education was around mathematics instruction. I focus more on teacher self-efficacy. What does it mean to manage through change? As a former math teacher, it was elitist in some ways. We tracked when I taught mathematics, and there was this sense of, for a parent, if my child got into the double advanced program, it meant something, right? And, who could really teach mathematics well in K-5? Every elementary teacher we always hear is a literacy teacher, but math, I don't know. I saw a lot of fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And so for me, it was this opportunity to say, can I be a change agent beyond my classroom and be a change agent around something I was super passionate about across the country? And I actually feel I was afforded that opportunity, not only in developing products, but talking and evangelizing about products, about implementing and training on various products and solutions. So it's been a really kind of interesting ride, as it relates to that in particular.
Well, as an instructional coach, as a teacher, there's not many adults who are teachers who are nervous about getting in front of their students. But once you move that into their peers, it becomes a big different thing. And so, being an instructional coach, you're now working with adults from all over the district. But then when you move into the corporate side of things, you're now working with adults from all over the country, if not sometimes the world. And so did you ever find yourself struggling with that kind of fear of speaking in front of adults?
My 8th grade students was the best training ground. I mean, anybody who's a former middle school teacher, everybody's like, how did you teach middle school? It was the, best experience for me to feel comfortable in front of small groups up to I've presented, to groups of 500 plus
Right.
many times, multiple times.
Yeah.
And really knowing how to adapt and being okay not knowing something as well, where, middle schoolers or high schoolers, they'll challenge you a lot, right? They want to kind of catch you.
Yeah.
So you kind of learn, how do I communicate things and be okay not being the expert on everything? Really helped me in terms of working with a broader set. But can I tell you something, Todd, that I think is the most unique thing that I've taken with me from being an 8th grade teacher? And that is, I'm convinced that everything I learned to be a C-suite in kind of the business world came from being an 8th grade teacher.
I could totally
I
see
mean,
that.
the amount of, can I tell you the one that sticks with me the most is when I would create, kind of the classroom rules and so forth. Of course, we would do that together with my students.
Yeah.
So we would have a list of things that we agreed upon, but the last one always was, whatever I expect of you, you should expect from your teacher. And so, like, if I didn't correct the assessments that night, I said, I didn't do my homework, because that is my homework. I need to understand what you know. You don't have to do your homework the next night because I didn't do it myself. So as a leader, I still bring that forward in saying, if I'm going to ask you to work hard and we believe and I believe I'm running at something big, how can I impact educators out there?
Yeah.
I believe I have to do it as well. If I'm not doing it, I can't expect it of others. So that one really rings true pretty often of how I operated with my students, and now how I operate with colleagues in a business setting.
And I love that you share that, because I think that's so important for people to hear. And I think, that's such a great leadership example of, whatever I expect of you, you also need to expect of me, and owning it when you don't hold up your end of the bargain and saying, you know what, I didn't do this today, guys. So I need to apologize or whatever. And I think you're exactly right. Like, I think that's a benefit that a lot of educators have over people who just may jump into the corporate world right away, is that we've got to work with kids and work that out. And kids are much more forgiving and help you through a lot of things. And, and with working with middle school students, they are much more, honest with you in the moment than the adults might be. And so you really get to work through different things with middle school or high school students. And so, now you end up at Nearpod. And so how did that come about?
I was working for Hand to Mind, which is hands-on manipulatives, math and science. And, really being able to, drive passion around. I'm all about being a change agent. So I think, hands-on learning is really a way. I'm a constructivist in nature. So as an educator, that's my pedagogy, that's my dogma, right?
Right.
Is I want to develop that understanding before I tell you about it. But it really is about, kind of changing that and that paradigm shift for many educators. And I'm passionate about working with resources that do that. I've also, but that's kind of my home, and that's where I've had most comfort over most of my career. But we know now, with the integration of technology in a more significant way, that we also have this moment of change for teachers.
Right.
That I actually see no different than math manipulatives. An example is, right? I like to always do comparisons of things.
Yeah.
Is, as a math coordinator, I would invest in all of these math manipulatives, put them in classrooms, right? Sometimes they sat on shelves, or the pattern blocks were being used for kids making pretty patterns, right? So they became kind of more of like a building tool.
Yeah.
Because if I didn't instruct or provide professional development or training how to use those to advance math understanding, sometimes they did get downgraded into more of a building block toy.
Right.
I think technology is no different. We're putting device in the hands of students and teachers. I can't just assume that I'm going to do that and it's going to elevate instruction. It's no different. It's just a tool. Now we've got to think about, how do I use this in a purposeful way to advance understanding and to create, surface learning for all kids, and what technology can do, right? I think hands-on manipulatives can build conceptual understanding, and technology can do what a teacher maybe can't do in terms of assessing understanding or hearing all voices. So basically, Nearpod came a calling. Again, I wasn't out looking. And I said, you know what? Because I'm so passionate about being a change agent, let's see what we can do with devices. I spent a lot of my career around these hands-on manips, and how can I develop conceptual understanding? How can I hear from every voice, but how can I also empower teachers at the same time? Which has been a theme. Empowerment of adult learners has been kind of a cornerstone and kind of a theme of most of my professional career.
Well, you've had the opportunity to work in the classroom, but now you've had this opportunity for a few years to work in corporate America.
Yeah.
What do you feel like you unexpectedly learned about that shift?
Oh, is the fact that being a classroom educator is so important to understand what it really means.
Right.
I'd say moving into corporate, I always say everybody thinks they know education because they were once a student.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yep.
they think they know education because their child's in a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know what it means to go a whole day without going to the bathroom? And like what that really means? Like, what planning time are you talking about? What does that, mean when you stayed late for multiple nights because you're worried about, did I ruin the Pythagorean theorem for this child forever because I didn't have the spot on lesson that day? Or to even really serious things, such as my last year in the classroom, one of my students committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what did that do for me as a human? Like, it's a very personal thing. I always say, if you put on paper now, it looks like I have a lot of responsibility, Todd, but I was felt way more responsible as a teacher.
And I can completely relate to that. And I really think that's true about like any position, especially in education. And educators, we're the worst too of thinking, just because we're a teacher, we understand what the custodian does. We understand what the nurse goes through, what the secretary goes through, what the principal goes through. And it's like, until you've held that position, you don't realize the depth of what that position entails, because there's so much unseen, unheard. There's so many things with our jobs in particular as educators that when we are in that position, we legally can't even talk about. And so that keeps a lot of people in the dark too about the complexity of what educators go through, which is why I love when there are former educators who work at these education companies, because they really understand what teachers are going through, and not just the idea of, oh, well, you need this. Here you go. We made something for you. Now all your problems are solved. And you were like, well, I needed that for this, but it's much more complicated than that. Like, can you help me think through da 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 da? And I think that that's what you really bring to the table, is being able to do that as well. And so, I often say that working with adults is just like working with big kids. Do you find the same thing from the corporate side?
Oh, absolutely. Adults are like eighth graders. They sit at the back of the room when you're doing a presentation, right? We see that in anybody who leads professional development, where you're like, come on, move on up.
Teachers do the same thing. Yep.
It's the same thing also with adults. Do you know how often I use proximity? And they don't realize I'm doing it. So I'm standing behind a chair, seeing what they're doing. They often laugh and will almost like call me Mrs. Kristoffersen, because there are times where I moderate a meeting like I would in a classroom. Because really it is no different. And that's why I keep saying, like, everything I learned as an eighth grade teacher, man, it is paying it forward, as I kind of lead through life, because you see those same kind of behaviors. We talk about, like, are all kids engaged? Are they all participating? I'd say the same thing about adults. In any meeting. And are we being respectful of our colleagues around presenting things in a way that's chunked so they can understand it, so that they have an opportunity for their voice to be heard, as we're making important decisions?
Right.
So it's like, it's the best training ground I could have ever had for kind of the world I live in now.
I bet. Well, Jennie, when you think about your own life, who is somebody that really stands out in your memory as being really instrumental in creating the woman we see today?
It's Mr. Henry in high school. Mr. Henry, again, these weird things we have in our past. We're like, I don't know how I had this course, but I had this like class that I had where I was like his assistant, and I got credit for it. It was my senior year of high school,
Uh-huh.
but it was so important, and he probably doesn't know the impact he had on me. But as many teenage girls go through, I was going through self-image issues, and you know, maybe probably not eating as often as I should have, and he noticed, right? Every day I would go to that class and he had a donut waiting for me on a piece of a napkin, right? And every day I'd say, "Thank you, Mr. Henry." And I would fold it up and I would give it to one of my classmates in the hallway. But every single day I came, there was a new donut. Couple months later, every day was an apple.
Uh-huh.
Switching it up. He saw me. He saw that I was struggling through something, and I was actually a very quiet child in high school. People won't believe it now because I'm not quiet now. But I wasn't going to speak up. I wasn't going to say anything, but he saw me. And right now, that's something I carry forward is I really try very hard. I'm not always perfect at it,
Yeah.
but I want someone to say, she saw me.
Mhm.
She saw me as a student when I was a classroom teacher. She saw me when I was a math coordinator.
Yeah.
And now, as I sit in kind of an executive leadership role, I want people to know that I see them.
Mhm.
And I might not always have the right solution, but I just try to pay attention a lot. But he had the biggest impact ever on my life because I really appreciated being seen as I was struggling through something that many, adolescent girls go through.
Well, I mean, I love that so much, and that I love that when somebody leaves an impact on you, that you then there want to carry out and make sure others feel the same way
Yeah.
you felt by them. And I think that's such a powerful testament to how the simplest things can leave such monumental impacts. Well, Jenny, I love ending all of my conversations with the same kind of question of, I believe as people, we hold things really close to our hearts and who we are and what we believe. And so for the people listening or watching today, if they were to walk away with one thing, what would your one thing be for them?
It's really about modeling,
Mhm.
and you know you know actions speak louder than words, and the way I kind of live my life is if I expect something from others, I need to expect it from myself as well.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I've lived everything from those classroom rules and kind of environment I established to what I do now today, every single day. I think it's about um, living what you preach, basically.
I
So
love that. Well, Jenny, I was so excited when you agreed to come on. So thank you so much for sharing
thanks.
some of your story today on Tell Your Story.
Thanks so much, Todd.
And thank you everybody for listening or watching another episode of Tell Your Story. Remember, you can check out past episodes on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you get your stuff, it's there. I hope today's conversation with Jenny has encouraged you to get out there and tell your story because every story matters.